Notice this next thing, Web API, I love Web API. In fact, when I come into a company, that's the first thing I look for is, can we use Web API? Because what Web API allows you to do is kind of disconnect your user interface from your business logic and your data. And so I love that. And we'll cover that in a future video. But for now, we'll just note that it's here. And it's really a partner with MVC. Notice how these two are both checked when you select Web API. And these other ones down here we're not going to cover, but we'll get into those possibly in a future video. But for now, MVC. Now we could still select Web API with web forms or even add unit tests. Now, I've had a couple of questions about the fact that I don't do unit tests in certain videos, and that's true, I don't. I'm going to cover unit tests as on their own in a video upcoming, but I try and keep my videos very, very lean and clean. I try to fill them up with a whole bunch of different technologies all at once, where you have to learn 4 and 5 and 6 different things in order to get this one thing working. Instead, I try and teach you a piece at a time. And I find that's the best way, at least that I've seen, to learn, is to learn a piece at a time instead of trying to get overwhelmed with all this stuff. So we're not going to add unit tests now. In a future video, we'll definitely come back and add unit tests to an MVC application to see how that works. Because it really is the same whether it's an MVC application or it's a desktop application or even just a class library. The other thing you're going to note is this change authentication button. This is pretty cool. It allows us to do different types of authentication, including Twitter authentication, Google authentication, Microsoft authentication, or Facebook, or our own authentication. So there's a lot of different options you can do with individual user accounts. It can also hook up to a Azure Active Directory, an Active Directory on site, or even Office 365. It could log in via your Windows credentials. So there's some fun things you can do there, some really powerful things, and really they make life easy as far as hooking these things up. For example, in individual user accounts, if you were to select this, the code is practically all there for hooking up to Facebook, Twitter, Google, or Microsoft. All you need to do is uncomment that section, put in your keys, and you can tell you where to get those API keys for it, and then you're good to go, and it's ready for authentication. So you can have your application, and you can say only if you're authenticated or only if you're in a certain group, and all that fun stuff. But for today, we're going to say no authentication. So we're all set to go, but before I hit OK, I want you to keep your eye on this lower left-hand corner. I'm going to try and zoom in on it, but when I hit OK, there's going to be some activity down here. I want to see if you can kind of look at that and watch that, and we'll talk about what it's doing. So I hit OK, and right down here, there you go, adding Bootstrap, adding jQuery, and it's adding a whole bunch of different stuff. And so if you look at just the progress bar, which is up here right now, if you look at that, it seems, but if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see a lot of stuff happening. Now, some people kind of skip over that or miss that, but what that's doing is it's loading a whole bunch of different NuGet packages. And if you're not familiar with NuGet is Microsoft's package manager. And what it allows us to do is take a bit of code and wrap it in a package and say, this code does this one thing. It may convert data to JSON. That's great. And so you have one package that does that. And for example, in this application, we have a package for jQuery. Well, jQuery is a JavaScript library. And what Microsoft has said is, instead of us reinventing the wheel and saying, we're going to create our own JavaScript library for doing what jQuery does, we recognize that jQuery does things really well. And so we're going to bring them in as a package. instead of us doing ourselves. And so what this makes our MVC application be is a modular application. It's no longer Microsoft saying, here's all your stuff, use our stuff, don't use anybody else's stuff, and be separate from the world. Instead, what it's saying is, this is what everybody else is doing, so we're going to bring this in as well. For example, a popular front-end HTML and CSS framework is called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap was actually created by Twitter. And it was originally called Twitter Bootstrap, but now it's just called Bootstrap. And if you go to getbootstrap.com, you can see Bootstrap in its current form, and the newer versions are coming out. And that's a great framework. Well, MVC says, you know what? That's a great framework. So we're going to pull it in as a NuGet package. And so when you start up your MVC application, it's pulling all those NuGet packages in to build this completed template. So let's see the NuGet packages that are brought in for this template that's been created. So I right-click on References and say Manage NuGet Packages. In my Installed section, notice I have all of these different NuGet packages. There's a lot. For example, if you look, there is jQuery. Now, one of the things you gotta note is right off the bat, I have 17 updates to do. In fact, jQuery, the version brought in by the template is 1.10.2, but the latest stable version is 3.1.1. Now you may be like me, when you see updates that need done, you want to just hit that update button. And in some cases, that's not a problem. But whenever you see a major version number change, that, for example, that 1 has to a 3 now, that's something to look into. There's been 2 major versions of jQuery since this 1.10.2. Since that's the case, there's probably breaking changes in there to be aware of. What I would not recommend you do is I would not recommend to come to Updates, select all packages, and just say Update. If you do that, you will create some problems in your MVC template right off the bat. Now, with that being said, I do think that you should update these packages. It's just you're going to need to figure out, can I do an update to the latest version? Or, for example, when it comes to my jQuery, maybe I should go and move to the 1.12.4, which is in the same major version. So it's really up to you. Now, if you're starting off with a blank template like this, or a blank MVC application, you could try just updating everything. And depending on when you do the download, when you do the template, you'll have a different number of updates, you'll have different places to update them to. And so it may work for you, it may not work for me. It all depends on timing. But if you're starting off from scratch, hey, it's a great time to try it. The other thing to note is sometimes you'll have this box checked. Now, with this box checked, notice Bootstrap. Installed is 3.0. The version, the latest pre-release is 4.0.0 Alpha 6. Well, that's an alpha release. That's not really something you want to have in a production application. But maybe if you're trying things out or learning what the new 4.0 Bootstrap has in store for you, maybe you want to do that in a demo application. In which case you could check this box, include pre-release. But I would recommend for any application where you're going to be using this in a business environment or where it's going to go into production in some way, uncheck this box. Don't include pre-release. Notice now that Bootstrap says the latest version is 3.3.7. That's the latest stable. You can still do this drop down here and look at all the different versions and change versions. So if you have this pre-release checked, you could say, yes, I see Alpha 6, but I really want to do 3.3.7. So you could do that, but with this checked, and if you said just update all over here, it would update to the latest pre-release version. That's not necessarily a good thing. So by default, I would recommend unchecking that and then going from there. Alright, so that's enough about NuGet and about the packages that are installed. There's quite a few. Let's look at our template. And let's take a minute to talk about what is ASP.NET and what is MVC. ASP.NET is the umbrella under which Microsoft puts all of their web-focused tools and applications. It used to stand for Active Server Pages, which was that web forms thing I showed you earlier. But now it's just kind of the umbrella under which everything lives. And so MVC is one of those things that lives under the umbrella. MVC stands for Model View Controller. So 3 different things: models, views, and controllers. And we'll look at all 3 of those soon. Notice the controllers folder, the models folder, and the views folder. So we'll look at those in a minute. But one of the benefits of MVC is that all of our code, which is written in C#, is compiled and run on the server. Meaning, when the end user views a website that has been built with MVC, all they get is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They don't get the C# code. So all of our business logic, if we put it in C#, the end user never has access to that, even though they use the end result. Now, one thing a lot of people get confused on or miss entirely is the fact that MVC is a UI-centric pattern, a user interface. It doesn't really talk about or worry about or cover the business logic or the data access or the other things that are kind of behind the scenes. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you will have seen how I try and push you to put as much logic into your class library as possible. And the reason for that is because you can take that same class library and attach it here to this MVC application and connect it up. And so you could take an application that used to be a WinForm application, a desktop application, take away the WinForm, add in ASP.NET MVC, and as long as the logic was in the class library, so the business logic and the data access, there's very little work to be done in MVC to get the same result or a similar result, but now on the web. In fact, in my C# application course, where we built the tournament tracker application, we pushed everything possible into our class library with the intent of changing the user interface, which is a WinForm application. The intent is to change that into something else later down the road. And in fact, I'll be creating an add-on course to change that WinForm application to a WPF application, but I'll also be doing another add-on course that changes the WinForm application over to be an ASP.NET MVC application. And so we can do both of those things by just replacing the user interface, not the entire application. So let's start with an overview of what MVC really does, the M, the V, and the C. Now, the heart of MVC is the controllers. This is kind of the backbone of MVC. What the controllers do is they link the views with the data. So the controller is controlling the application. Now in our case, when we start off with a blank template, we actually have one controller already built, the home controller. Now if you note, there's not a lot of code in here. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is because this really is just a sample to get you started. But the other reason is because the MVC framework uses some naming conventions to link things up and make things link together. So in this case, we have the index action result, the about method, which returns an action result, and the contact method, which returns an action result. Now, an action result is usually a view. Now, remember, models, views, and controllers. So this controller is saying, return this view. Now, it doesn't say which view to return. It just says, return view. Where does that view come from? Well, if you have a home controller, then it's going to look for the view in the views folder under the home folder. And here it's going to say, okay, this is the index action. Well, there's the index view. So that's, we'll get into the view in a minute, but that's the convention that it uses. Is it looks at home controller means under views, home folder, and that takes the method name and says that's the page name. That's called the action. And the result of the action result, is to display the view. In this case, it says just display the index.cshtml page. So for the about method, it's going to say, when it says return view, it's going to return the about.cshtml page. So this is what the home controller does, is it says, here's which view to display when you call this method. Now that's very, very simplistic, and yet it does have some power behind it, and we'll see that in a minute. But don't worry if you say that looks really too simple, because your methods here will probably have a little bit more code to them. Maybe not a lot, but a little bit more. So we see this index action. We've already kind of opened this page up, but let's open up the index.cshtml page, the view, to see what's in this view. And we'll close out that suggestion for now. Now, if you're familiar, and you probably should be if you're going to do ASP.NET MVC, if you're familiar with HTML, that's all this is for the most part. Right here is HTML. We'll ignore this part right up here for just a minute. But this HTML is just HTML. I mean, if you want to change this to an H2 tag, you just type 2 instead. And there's an H2 instead of H1. And change it back. Now, if you're familiar with how a page is laid out, you'll notice something here. We're missing HTML. Normally, a complete HTML page has a head and a body. And in the head, we have things like our CSS and some settings like the page title and other things. In the body, we have HTML like this. We also have our JavaScript references and other things. Well, we don't have that here. And the reason why is because a view is just a part of your overall page. We're going to cover where the rest of that stuff is in just a minute. But for now, just note that this is just a part of our page. So that's a view. Now, unfortunately, if you notice over here, the models folder is empty. Now, I really wish that the default, when a template gets created, I wish it had at least one method that uses a model. Unfortunately, we don't have that demo. But don't worry, I'm going to walk you through creating a new controller, new views, and using models to connect those views. So we'll get there. But for right now, just note that there are no models here, but a model is simply a class with properties. That's all it really is. In fact, let's create our model now, just so you can see what it looks like. Add class. We're going to call this the person model. Now let's follow the same convention we're using here. Home controller, well, person model. So public class person model. And I'll type prop, string, first name, prop, string, last name, prop, int, age. Now, normally I wouldn't have a property called age that's an integer because age is a changing thing. So instead, probably have something like a date time with maybe birthday. And that way I could always know what the age is based upon where we are in the year. But in this case, I just want to have an integer, so let's call it age and be good to go with that. And let's add one more. Prop bool is alive. So this right here, this class, is a model. It has 4 properties in it. That's all it really does. We could do some default setting. So for example, we could say equals true, default to true for is alive. And we could even default the age to something if we wanted to, but we'll default it to 0, which is the default for an integer, but now it's at least set. And same thing with first and last name, but we'll leave those alone. So that is a model. And we'll use that in a little bit to create, when we create a new controller. But for now, let's leave it like it is and close it out. Now I had said that the view is missing stuff. There's stuff missing here. Now I'll show you where that is. So if you go into Views folder, and you look in the shared folder here, there is an underscore layout.cs HTML. If we double click that, this looks like an actual HTML page. We have our head up here, we have our body here, we have some interesting things, but it says scripts, so at least we know that there's jQuery and Bootstrap scripts, but it's different. And I'll cover this in a minute, but for now, just note that's where the scripts go, the JavaScript scripts. So this is more like our page. Well, if you notice right down here, inside of the body, inside of a div called container body content, or the class container and body content, we have this @renderBody. Now what this does, and I'll explain the ats in a minute, but for right now, what this does right here is it takes our view, so index.cs HTML, it takes that HTML code and sticks it here. So if we want to go to the About page, it takes out the code for index from here, and it takes the code from About and puts it here. And that's how it changes from page to page. And so when we're creating a new controller with new views, all we're really doing is just saying replace this code right here, this little bit, with this bit of HTML that I wrote, whether it's little or big. For example, the About page, very little. Whereas the index page, it's a bit more. Doesn't matter. We just stick it here. Now, why is that helpful? Well, notice up here, and you don't have to understand all the HTML was doing, and we'll see what it's doing. But for right now, just note, this up here is navigation. Well, all of our navigation is rendered once. So it always looks the same no matter what page we're on. And that's kind of helpful. Down here, we have our footer with a copyright notice. And it says copyright datetime.now.year. So 2017 is the current year. 2017 my ASP.NET application. That's the copyright that goes on every single page. The scripts are on every single page. Up here we have styles on every single page. And so all that stuff doesn't have to be repeated from page to page to page, or from view to view to view. Instead, each view just takes its code and puts it into this right here. And so it takes it as a part and puts it into the whole. Now the last thing I want to talk about before we actually hit play and see how this website renders. The last thing I want to talk about is what's called the Razor syntax. R-A-Z-O-R. Razor. And the Razor syntax is Microsoft's creation that allows us to mix C# and HTML. And it's really quite brilliant. Notice everywhere we see this @ symbol right here. That @ symbol says, I am going to bring in some C# code. But notice how it's mixed right inside of our HTML. It's not a problem. The rendering engine is smart enough to know when C# stuff starts and when it ends. So for example, down here, we have @html.actionLink, and then it passes in 3 parameters. What this does is it creates a link on a page, but that link is based upon a path, a route. So it says the home controller, the index action, and it says we're going to have the actual text be home. Now, why is it important to have this method right here? Well, normally a link has the full path. So http://localhost:13.297, whatever it is, / all that stuff. We don't have any of that here. This method takes care of everything, including finding out what the link is, what the URL path should be, all the way to the home controller, the index action. It's kind of a nice little tool to have. Well, that's a C# method. But notice right here, we have our list item tag. And so it says list item, and then it has C# code right away. So it's HTML code, markup, and then C# code. And then right back to HTML markup to close out the list item. And so the rendering engine says, no problem, I know how to do this. And so it knows based upon the brackets or the spaces or whatever else we do, it says, okay, I know this is a transitioning from C# back to HTML. Every once in a while, this gets a little confused. Don't worry, there's a way to get around that to tell the rendering engine this is where C# starts and ends, and that's with curly braces. But for the most part, this right in line works really well. And so down here, we have the copyright symbol, and then we say grab the C# datetime.now.year, and then it puts that value, which is 2017 for this current year. It puts that right in this spot and keeps going. Remember that the client never has access to this, not even in the code behind in the browser. Instead, all they see is 2017. So a big part of the MVC framework is using this Razor engine. Now notice on the index page we skipped over this right here. There's those curly braces. And here, what it's doing is it's saying viewbag.title equals this. So it's actually saying, here's this property, assign it this value. And that's all C#. Notice a semicolon even. And so we have this at curly brace and then close curly brace. So the Razor engine knows that everything between these two curly braces is C# code only. Now the viewbag itself, this is a pet peeve of mine. The viewbag, I would recommend that you not use that often. Use it sparingly. Once people learn about the viewbag, they tend to think that it's for everything. And it really isn't. The viewbag should be used as little as possible. But what it is this grab bag. You can use it for anything you want. This .title property doesn't technically exist until we create it. So for example, I could say viewbag dot, notice the dot does not bring up any IntelliSense, dot superhero equals Tim. Just a little thinking too much of myself, but that's okay. So that works. It would compile and work because I've now added a new property to the viewbag. We can put any kind of object in this property we want because it's dynamic. Now in this case, Microsoft has said we want to use the viewbag.title. If we go back to layout.cshtml and scroll at top, notice here in the head we have the title tag. And that's the title for the web page. And it says at viewbag.title dash my ASP.NET application. So this page can change that title. And if we look, the About page also changes that title. So depending on which view you are going to, the title of the web page will change, even though we're not actually changing this right here, the actual layout.cshtml, because we are changing a bit of it with this viewbag.title. So if you want to use it for little stuff like that, that's great. Just don't stuff it full of tons of data. That makes your application bloated, and it slows down your web server, and it causes some problems. So just try and limit that to just little stuff. Okay, so it's a quick overview. We've learned about what Razor is. We've learned that this right here is just a web part, a piece, and that piece gets put into this at render body, which is Razor, by the way. Just calling the render body method inside of C#. And so our actual web page is rendered off of layout.cshtml, and then which view we're looking at, index, contacts, about, or a different one we've created. So let's actually run this right now and just see how this web page looks. Now right now it says Google Chrome next to the play button. It may be different for you. In fact, if I do the drop down here, notice Chrome, Internet Explorer, Microsoft Edge, or even Windows Phone. I don't have Firefox installed currently, so I don't have Firefox in this list, but if I did, that browser would show up as well. And so since Google Chrome is my default browser, it gets chosen here, which I love Chrome, so we'll use that. The reason this choice is significant is because we can actually open different browsers to test out if they all look similar. And this is more of an issue going back a couple years than it is now, but there used to be major problems with rendering from Internet Explorer to Chrome to, Safari. And so the idea of having the ability to display your application on one or more browsers and try it out and switch very, very easily was a big deal. Now, it's still an issue, but it's not nearly the issue that it was. You can also say, if you say browse with, and wait for it. There we go. We can actually select multiple and say browse. And if you do that, it will open. Let's actually close that one, or not select that one. So it could say open Chrome, Internet Explorer, and Edge. It will actually open 3 different windows at the same time and show you the same exact website. For now, though, we're just going to run Google Chrome. So I'll run this and get this page right here. We're saying, okay, your application is starting. When it starts, here is our application. Now, again, remember this is Bootstrap, and if you're not familiar, Bootstrap is a responsive framework, meaning when I maximize this page, it laid out in 3 different columns down here, but if I were to shrink it down, notice those 3 columns are now 1 stacked column. And if I shrink it down even further, notice this menu bar up here, that changes to this little drop down here. That's just stuff that Bootstrap does, and it's really, really cool, and it does a lot of fun stuff. But for now, let's look at our page. Notice it says up here in the upper left, home page, because we are on the index page. Remember, index set the view bag. We come back over here, the view bag.title to home page. So now let's go to the About page. Also notice the URL before you continue. The URL here is localhost 63,564. This right here is the port number, and that will change depending on your build, because it will change where it's hosted. And so don't worry about that. That's just the IIS Express on your machine running in the background, a copy or a slimmed down copy of IIS, which is Microsoft's Internet Information Server, which is how they host web pages. And they have to have that running in order to actually view a web page. Now, if I look at the code behind for this, hit F12. Alright, so here is our code behind. If I look at this 2017, so if I select that, notice it says copyright 2017, not datetime.now.year. I can't see that. I told you that, but I wanted to show you that. Okay, so you've seen that the URL right now is just localhost. But watch what happens when I click the About link. It now says /home/about. And this is the About page. Also notice up here it says About in my title bar. If I say Contact, it says /home/contact. Go back to home, there's no /anything. And this is all about routing. So if I wanted a contact page, and I knew that it was the home controller, so /home controller/contact page, and I hit enter, it takes me to the contact page. So this is the route to go to contact. We can avoid having people have to type those things in by creating these links. Notice that link is one of those action links created by the Razor engine based upon the controller and the action. Now we'll get into how those routes are set up in just a minute, but for now I'll go back and look at this page right here. Now let's make this half the size of the screen. We'll select Visual Studio as the other half. Check this out. Now if I come over here to my index.cs HTML page, which is the view, I can start making some modifications, even though I'm currently running. I can make modifications to my HTML. Not my C#, but my HTML. So for example, this ASP.NET and right here, I want to change that to say Demo on YouTube. I save that. Nothing happens. But wait, there's this little refresh link here. If I click that, notice it's already refreshing the Chrome browser. And it says demo on YouTube. Now I could have come over here and hit refresh over here. So why is it important to have this little link here? Well, right now we only have one browser linked. Notice a little tooltip there. But what if I open this in Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Edge? Do you think I want to hit refresh on 4 different browsers? Instead, I just hit the little refresh right here, and we'll refresh every linked browser. You can also do the drop down here and see which browsers there are by going to the browser link dashboard, or you can see the actual command Control plus Alt plus Enter to refresh the linked browsers. Next, let's look at closing this out and see where these routes take us. So the routing happens in this app_start folder. We have bundle config, filter config,